Greetings. Good evening. Greetings. My name is Karen Engel, and I'm co-director of the Bernard and Audrey Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice here at UT and housed at the law school. On behalf of the Rappaport Center and the law school, it's my honor to welcome you into our space for this very exciting panel. And you can see from the buzz in the room, there's a bit of a family reunion going on, and we're very excited to have many people who we plan to have here, as well as some additional guests, and I'll mention in a moment. So I feel really fortunate to share the stage, even for a moment, with this incredibly accomplished panel. You'll be introduced to each of them shortly, but I want to say at the outset that everyone on the panel is a UT graduate, and hope they're happy about that. So I'm happy to welcome them back, and I'm especially pleased to welcome Sissy Farenthold, Terry O'Rourke, and Representative Ana Hernandez Luna back to the law school, where they each received their degrees. We've come to this panel as a result of a project we're doing at the Rappaport Center called the Frances T. Sissy Farenthold Archives Project, which is a 3-year project documenting Sissy's contribution to Texas and U.S. politics, the women's peace movement, and international human rights and justice. The project has been made possible by a generous gift from the Creekmore and Adele Fath Charitable Foundation. And Creekmore, as some of you might know, was a friend of B. Rappaport since their time as students at UT. And he and Adele were friends of Sissy's for many years, dating back to her 1973 gubernatorial campaign, which Creekmore managed. B, Creekmore, and Adele are no longer with us, but I suspect we will all feel their presence here tonight. You may have noticed that we have co-sponsors. This is a co-sponsored event. So the Briscoe Center and the Texas Observer are in on it with us. And that's fitting because coincidentally, or maybe not, B's and Creekmore's papers are housed alongside Sissy's at the Briscoe Center, which the center director, Don Carlton, will tell us about in a few minutes. The center is obviously an important collaborator in this project because it's based on Sissy's papers. And of course, both Creekmore and B also had a special founding and sustaining relationship to the Texas Observer. And as everyone on this panel is close to the Observer and its coverage of the Dirty 30 will be part of the focus of our discussion, we could not imagine doing the event without the Observer. And Piper Nelson, the Observer publisher, will say a few words in a moment as well. Now, before I turn over the floor to Don and Piper, let me just say a little bit more about the Farenthold Archives Project and about why we think this event, which we hope it will be one of many, actually, is an important part of the documentation of Sissy's life and career. Those of you who know Sissy know at least 3 things about her. She's never shied away from her convictions. She's always maintained a sense of humor, even in political dark times, and she never toots her own horn. Now, the story of the Dirty 30 and of this event demonstrate those 3 things about her. With regard to sticking to her convictions, as you'll hear tonight, Sissy played a key role in the events that marked the Dirty 30's history. As a relatively junior lawmaker, she saw foul play, and she did what she knew was the right thing to do, even though she was in the minority, and even though it led to the wrath of many of her colleagues. Now, Sissy's sense of humor can be seen in her approach to the name the Dirty 30. As you'll hear, and some of you might even remember, she and her 29 colleagues in the 1971 Texas House did not originally identify themselves as the Dirty 30. I mean, it has a nice ring, but it's not usually, you don't usually say, let's get together and call ourselves that. Rather, the story goes, a lobbyist who didn't like the way that he was forced to vote on the Farenthold, or that the way that the legislature was forced to vote on the Farenthold resolution, is said to have muttered something about those 30 dirty bastards. And Sissy points out that the 30 decided to go with the name. Sounds, kind of cool, as long as you drop the bastards. So that's where it came from. And in terms of Sissy not tooting her own horn, She did agree quite generously to allow us to talk about the Dirty 30 in relationship to her career. But she insisted that she was only one of many players. So we've enjoyed hearing from Sissy about the important roles that Terry O'Rourke, Tom Bass, Lane Denton, who we're thrilled is here to join us, Ronnie Duggar, and many others played from a variety of places and perspectives. And we're thrilled to have the chance to hear their stories firsthand as they reminisce this evening and consider the effects of their contributions. Finally, I want to say that this event would not have been possible without Susan Richardson, who you'll meet in a few moments as she'll help moderate the panel. And Susan's sitting over in the jury box. Susan recently joined the Rappaport Center to lead up the Farenthold Archives project. She's a longtime journalist and editorial writer, focused on public policy and human rights. And as she began to delve into Sissy's papers, she saw the importance of highlighting the Dirty 30 history and of bringing many people together, including those of you in the audience, to share their perspectives on it. So I thank Susan for her tremendous work in learning about the history of the Dirty 30 and organizing this panel, and for the way she's already begun to shape this project. So with no further ado, and I know that was a bit of ado, I will turn over the podium to Don Carlton now, who will be followed by Piper Nelson, who will introduce the representative who is moderating the panel, who will then begin the conversation. Thank you all for being here.
Well, thank you, Karen, very much. And it's an interesting location for me. I'm not normally in a courtroom, but at any rate, we're delighted to co-sponsor this event, the Briscoe Center with the Texas Observer and the Rappaport Center. It's sort of an amazing sort of thing, actually, the way this is all developed. Sissy and I were talking about this just a few minutes ago. I mean, this is a natural co-sponsorship for the Doc Briscoe Center for many reasons. Among them, and this is where I'll break loose just for the personal for just a second. When I was in graduate school, I was among the legions of college students in Houston who were trying to get Sissy elected in the Democratic primary in 1972. I even took off a semester from graduate school to work on that campaign and also the McGovern campaign in the fall. And so it's a personal thing, and I've known it's been my great good fortune to know Sissy now for quite a long time. And in addition, of course, the Texas Observer was the Bible for all of us who were in Sissy's campaign, even at the low level that I was at. So this is even more wonderful to have Ronnie here as well. But, we talk about hyperlinks today with the internet and everything else. I mean, it's just amazing, all of the linkages that go on here. It's just kind of endless. And the Rappaport Center here, of course, is doing the Sissy Farenthold Legacy Project. The Briscoe Center is doing the Bernard Rappaport Legacy Project, parallel. And both projects have products that will be on the web and available to everyone. So it's a great combination of things. The other obvious reasons to me that the Briscoe Center is such a natural co-sponsor for this event is the fact is our mission is to support, facilitate, and produce original research in the field of U.S. history, and especially on the focus on Texas political history. In news media history. So you've got the Texas Observer over here in the news media part, and of course the Dirty 30 and Sissy Farenthold and her colleagues who were in the Dirty 30. I'm going to brag just a little bit. The fact is that anyone who is researching the political history of Texas, especially in the 20th century, has to spend time at the Doc Briscoe Center's Research and Collections Division. We're located over in Sid Richardson Hall. Not only do we proudly serve as the archival home of the Sissy Farenthold papers, but we are also the archival home of the Texas Observer archive, as well as the home of the papers of Creekmore Fath, Molly Ivins, Russell Lee, John Henry Falk, J.R. Parton, Ralph Yarborough, Bob Eckhart, Henry B. Gonzalez, Ann Richards, and of course, B. Rappaport, as well as many others who have played significant roles in the history of the liberal wing of the Texas Democratic Party and the legislative reform movement of the early 1970s, which were really spun out of the events related to the Sharpstown affair. And, of course, the person for whom our center was named, Dolph Briscoe, was elected governor in 1972, largely as a result of the political fallout from the Sharpstown affair. So it's especially appropriate for the Briscoe Center to serve, as I said, as one of the sponsors for today's program. The other side of this is that I got to become very close to former governor, the late Governor Dolph Briscoe. And I helped him write his memoir. And as I say, I got to know him very, very well. And I am totally sure and certain that he would be delighted that we are co-sponsoring this event. Before he died, he made a nice contribution to the Molly Ivins dinner for the Observer. And I called him up and I said, Governor, I am so proud of you for donating that money on behalf of the Molly Ivins dinner that the Observer said. And the governor said, well, Don, I don't know that Molly ever said a nice thing about me. But she loved Texas, and that's why I did it. So I stand here fully delighted that Dolph Briscoe's money is helping pay for this event. And again, I know he would be delighted. So I invite all of you to visit the Briscoe Center's Research Division here on campus, or drop by our John Nance Garner Museum in Uvalde, or the Sam Rayburn Museum in Bonham, which we also are divisions of the Briscoe Center. So enough from me. I'm eager to hear our panelists. So thank you very, very much for being here.
Talk for a couple hours. My name is Piper Steggy Nelson, and I'm the publisher of the Texas Observer. Started in 1954, the Observer is a nonprofit news organization that specializes in telling the investigative, political, and social justice stories from the absolute strangest state in the Union. We were started by this esteemed man, Ronnie Duggar, right here, and we're honored to be with him here today. Our award-winning magazine is published monthly, and our website features daily content, especially about this astounding legislative session that we're in right now. And don't worry, if you do not have a subscription, which would be ridiculous, there are subscription cards out there, and we would love to have you join us. In addition to my great personal respect for all of the people on this panel, it's really a treasure to be helping to host an event that highlights a great revolution in Texas politics. At the time, the Texas Observer was one of the few media outlets in the state that was consistently covering the Sharpstown scandal and the work of the Dirty 30. And that's really emblematic of what we do. We tell the stories that the mainstream press is either ignoring or underreporting. So for that reason alone, it's great to be here tonight. But it's also my pleasure to introduce Representative Ana Hernandez Luna. Ana was born in Reynosa, Mexico, and was raised in Pasadena, Texas. She worked in the legislature and then went to law school here, Hookham, and then became a lawyer at the firm of Kerrigan, McCloskey, and Roberson, LLP. She was first elected to office in December of 2005, and she's currently serving her fourth complete session. She's representing District 143 out of Houston. It covers the cities of Galena Park and Jacinto City, portions of Pasadena, and Channelview. She is the vice chair of the Committee on Elections and serves on the House Committee of Pensions, Investments, and Financial Services. In addition to all of her great work, she has been a legislative champion for immigrant rights, for women's rights, and for the people of Texas. She's also the mother to Gregory, who will be one very soon. She was also my boss. When I served as legislative director for Representative Jessica Farrar in the 2001 session, Ana Hernandez Luna was my chief of staff at age 21, I will point out. It was an unforgettable experience and very fun, and I'm very honored to introduce her to you. Please welcome Representative Ana Hernandez-Luna.
Thank you, Piper. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. What a great group. I'm excited to see such a great turnout and honored to be up here with such an esteemed panel. Before we start, I just want to kind of give a little bit of background on what it is we'll be discussing today and looking forward to hearing more insight from our panelists. In 1971, a coalition of Democratic and Republican state representatives called for an ethics investigation of the then Speaker of the House and other Texas officials named in a federal bribery conspiracy case. This small band of reformers turned the federal case into a political issue, sparked a movement to limit the influence of special interests in the legislature, and inspired Frances Sissy Farenthal's run for governor in 1972. They were known as the Dirty 30. Throughout the 62nd legislature, the Dirty 30 used parliamentary tactics, procedures, and rules to attempt to bring more transparency to legislative dealings. They are widely credited with keeping the federal bribery case known as the Sharpstown stock fraud scandal in the public eye. Before we start, I would like to introduce some of our panelists and give them an opportunity to give some brief introductory remarks. And we'll start with two of the members of the Dirty 30 that are to my right, Sissy Farenthal and Tom Bass. Sissy Farenthal. In 1968, Sissy Farenthal was elected to represent Nueces and Kleber counties in the Texas House of Representatives. At that time, she was the only woman in the Texas House. In 1972 and 1974, she ran in the Democratic primary for governor, losing both times to Dolph Briscoe. She gained national recognition during the 1972 Democratic National Convention when she came in second for the vice presidential nomination, the first woman to be seriously considered for that position. Sissy currently serves as the honorary director at the Rothko Chapel on the Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justices Advisory Board, and is an emeritus trustee of the Institute for Policy Studies.
Thank you.
Welcome. Tom Bass, a retired Army officer and educator, served in the Texas House of Representatives from 1962 to 1972. During his tenure, he was committee chair for 3 sessions and the Harris County delegation chairman for 2 sessions. In 1973, Bass was elected Precinct 1 Harris County Commissioner, where for the next 12 years he fought for strong financial disclosure and ethics rules for all county officials, as well as redistricting for the commissioners' precincts. He assisted in the development of the Greater Harris County 911 Emergency Network and later represented Harris County at the Texas Silver-Haired Legislature. Welcome, Tom. The other side we have Terry O'Rourke. In 1971, Terry O'Rourke was a young law student and volunteered with the Dirty 30. Today, he is a senior executive attorney in the office of Harris County Attorney Vince Ryan. Previously, he was a Texas Assistant Attorney General prosecuting industrial polluters on the Houston Ship Channel. He also worked on President Jimmy Carter's White House staff as counsel on energy price controls and environmental issues. Welcome, Terry. And last but not least, we have Ronnie Duggar. Ronnie Duggar is the founding editor of the Texas Observer and known as the godfather of progressive journalism. Since the Observer was founded in 1954, he has influenced some of the state's most famous writers and progressive: Molly Ivins, Willie Morrow, Lawrence Godwin, Billy Lee Bramer, and Jim Hightower, all of whom have worked at the Observer. In 1994, he left the Observer to move to Massachusetts, where his writing served as the force behind the populist movement Alliance for Democracy. He's also written a number of articles and books, including biographies of Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan. All right. I guess we'll have allow our panelists to say a few introductory remarks. So we'll start with you, Ms. Farenthal.
I'll be brief, I hope. Looking back on it all, I think one of the really extraordinary things, and we have Lane Denton here, I think of all the contributions that were made from those that are here and those that are not here. And I would like to acknowledge that, because if there was ever a cooperative effort, that was it. And I frankly, the panelists and Lane could say something that I don't remember, but I never saw a group that got along as well as we did. And maybe it was because we had a common enemy. Probably that was the case. But we'll develop things as we go along. But I want to thank everyone that was the part of it. I also want to say something else. Without volunteers, we couldn't have gotten started. And Terrence O'Rourke was one. He's the one that actually did the research that made the Farenthold resolution possible. And the other one is a woman that is now dead named Madeline Olds, who went through that budget, and we'll hear more about the budget later, because it was one of the things we really took on and tried to do something with. And she stayed up the whole night, because we were only given 18 hours to look through that budget. She stayed up all night and found the things that we needed to bring out. But this was not done by staff. We didn't have that kind of, and I don't think the legislature has it today. And I would like to just say one thing about our legislature. It is the only one of an industrialized state, an urban state, that doesn't have annual sessions. And when that issue came up when we were up there active, I was told that there were two groups that kept that from happening. One were the lobbyists, and the others were the large agencies. And we're not going to get anywhere until that's altered. So, end of my brief comments.
The Dirty 30 certainly was not something that we foresaw happening, but it did happen. And as Sissy mentioned, we came together as a group. This was my fifth session of the legislature when this thing broke. And I had told my students and my kids in the family that you could be a public official, you could do some good without compromising your integrity. Well, when the things that arose in connection with the Dirty 30 did arise, I talked to myself. I said, if you really mean what you've been saying, you can't be part of the speaker's team anymore. So I resigned the chairmanship of a committee and resigned from the Rules Committee, because that's the speaker's committee, and told the 30 that I'm devoting all of my effort and energy to digging into the rules where less than 30 can make an impact. And so several of the key things that we'll talk about this evening are a result of that. I second, even third, Sissy's telling of the volunteer help. I had a graduate student, Karen Lerner, who has now died, helping me, who did most of the digging out of the details that'll come up. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, my name is Terry O'Rourke, and I have to begin the confessions is that while I was baptized Irish Catholic, I was born a Democrat. So all of this came easy to me, but I really think it's important to say that because there are people who are serious historians doing this as well as a political scientist, that if you were to write profiles and courage about Texas in some magic moment in time, that the lives of all of these people, each one of them so vastly different, who really did have to stand up and make courageous decisions. I can remember being with Tom Bass in his office down by the Linoleum Club, if you remember that. And to really realize that, I was just a law student. It was no big deal to me because I wasn't sitting there. I had really nothing to lose. But to see these people who do it, and I know that Sissy will not say this, but I want to do this now, is I was standing next to her, and it didn't go on day one. We had a plan, and we had it executed, and it was a secret plan, and we had to catch them by surprise, and we had to get the right moment and the right players and the right signals on the floor of the House. And when that magic moment came to do it, I looked at her, and she will not tell you this, but I can tell you what it was like for her to have all of these extraordinarily angry white men looking at her with hatred. And the courage that it took for her to stand up and say, "Mr. Speaker, I rise." And if that is not ever captured in film, it will be a mistake, because it was truly one of the moments that I will live with my entire life. And then when it began, all of them stood up and came out from different places. And who could believe that Fred Agnich or somebody else, these, even by today's standards, ultra right-wing Republicans were working with the liberals and people like Tom Bass, who are mainstream. Anyway, the other moment, the historians who are here, is that the procedural aspect that made this possible of privilege of the House, which was a very specialized work that I did with Glenn Wilkerson, who's not here, also really came because I had the privilege of working as a page boy for Ralph Yarbrough, and I got to watch in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate how rules are played out and how important it was. So when it came time, none of us really knew, because there was nothing ever done like this ever before, but there were precedents in the Congress of the United States, and it worked.
In the 50s through 1960, what the movement with figures in it like Ms. R.D. Randolph and Ralph Yarbrough and other leaders who could easily be named were doing was organizing the precincts in the major cities. And we built up, they built up, and the Observer accounted for it as it was being done, a genuine liberal movement which was in rebellion against Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn. Because those party bosses had no interest in democracy at all. They were running things to their satisfaction in the state. They didn't want a cantankerous liberal organization in Houston or in San Antonio, where they became very powerful. Well, in 1956, they elected Ms. Randolph, the National Democratic Committeeman, over the objections of Lyndon Johnson, who wanted Lieutenant Governor Ben Ramsey to be the Democratic National Committeeman, who was one of the most corrupt and worthless lieutenant governors in the history of the United States. Well, that without going into all of that, which, because it would take the rest of the evening, that culminated then in John F. Kennedy selecting Lyndon Johnson for vice president. That ended the liberal movement in Texas for that decade, because Johnson at that time, playing the politics necessary, as he would play anything necessary to become president, was oppressing. He called us the Red Hots in his speeches in 1959 and 60 when he was running against Kennedy for the nomination. We were the Red Hots down in Texas, because he knew very well that would cause him some difficulty in presenting himself as a consistent liberal for the nomination. I go into that because then there was this sinking. The movement simply stopped existing as a movement. Johnson forced Ms. Lloyd Benson's wife in as Democratic National Committeeman, and that was then a very slow decade thereafter. I left the Observer as editor in 1961, realizing I didn't know much about politics when something like that could happen. Well, so we're going into now 1972, and we got toward 1972, and you've got Mr. Nixon president, and down here, there's nothing. I mean, the legislature, which is most frequently in its general historical import negative, retrograde, and reactionary, continued so. However, this group in the Texas House, there were about 30 liberals. And in the Texas Senate, as I recall it, even at this time, there were still 5 or 6, you were never sure, liberals, or people we'd call liberal. We understand what we mean. Well, what I want to do is contribute a moment just like Terry just did. That is the moment I most vividly recall. As you all know and will enumerate at your leisure, I understand that the name Dirty 30 was exactly what the lobbyists in the halls were calling your group, Sissy. And they loved the name, and so they characterized themselves as the Dirty 30. It really took. And they were having their first press conference on the first floor of the Capitol. And they were all assembled, almost all of them were assembled down at the end toward Lavaca Street, you know, on that first floor, those big halls. And they had a microphone in front of them, and they were all men. Well, I happened to be strolling down that hall in company with a few people, including Sissy Farnthold, and I saw exactly what happened. Here were all these Texas macho guys, right? And with all due respect, Lane and Tom,
Tom wasn't there
I'll
yet.
speak only for myself. I am an unrecovering Texas chauvinist pig, and all of us were. I mean, I don't know to what extent any of us have recovered, damn little. But at that time, we had no insight. All of us expected to speak first. Of course, we were the ones who would always speak first in class if we were in school. Of course, for a woman to speak first, well, that showed some sort of mental retardation. And there was this microphone in front, and I was standing there watching what was happening. Their first press conference, and Sissy took the microphone while they were all standing there expecting to be invited to take it.
Ronnie,
That's
Ronnie,
That's it.
let's get the record straight. He suggested it.
Well, I'll tell you what, that was an affirmative action that was an affirmative action. Now, remember, this was 1971. Feminism was just coming on. This was a violent feminist act that you committed. I grant I might have whispered a word or two in your earball, but Sissy did this. Now, she did it out of anger as well as out of courage. I think that's very important. I think we underestimate the importance of anger in social justice and social change. She was angry. And I'm sure I don't speak for her, but I think I recognized in it. She was, Creekmore and I, we were just a couple of Texas machos too. And she had enough of that, I think. And then here came along this corruption. And what it did was it revived the dead Texas progressive movement in 1971. But what it did more than that is Sissy came and ran for the governor of Texas. Now, a lot of people think that Moe Ferguson was the first woman running for governor of Texas. She was, but she was just a dummy for her husband. Her husband had turned out to be the sworn enemy of the University of Texas, and they had to throw him out. And so they put Moe in, but she was nothing but a cat's paw of her husband. We all knew that. The real antecedent for Sissy's act was a woman named Minnie Fisher Cunningham, who ran for governor against Coke Stevenson, as I recall, in World War II. And Minnie Fisher was a great supporter of the Observer, and I remember one time I'm out of time. Oh, well, stop. I didn't realize that nobody told me any time. I'm going to go on whether you like it or not. What are you going to do about that? Now, I want to call attention to the fact that the Dirty 30 was a precursor of what happened to the liberal movement under the benign administrations of a variety of people, including George H.W. Bush. Remember what Bush did to the word liberal in the United States? The L word? That was a part of smearing people on the left, associating them with the Soviet Union and communism, not to mention socialism, which of course is the same thing as communism, right? The Dirty 30 was taking it with the courage that was characteristic of Sissy's movement. Now, in all respect to Tom and Lane and Tom Moore and all of your colleagues, this was Sissy's movement. It culminated in her governor's race. And that eventuated then in Hightower's long and fruitful career, and of course in Ann Richards' career. But I want to say this, that this compares really to the kind of act that Frederick Douglass performed against slavery. It's comparable. Now, she doesn't know I'm going to do this, but I don't give a hurt. I'm going to do it anyhow. She was like the one woman who voted against one of the world wars in the Congress. She was like the one member of the Texas Legislature who, when the Texas House met and voted that the University of Texas and Jim Hart should fire Clarence Ayers, the radical economics professor, only Johnny Barnhart voted no. Just one guy. And like Henry Gonzalez, when Henry stood up all night, I think about 18, 20 hours. You remember Gonzalo? I'm so proud to see you here. Gonzalo Barrientos. And I remember I was the only reporter who stayed with him all night. And he said, who speaks? Who speaks for the Negro? Who speaks for the Hispanic? For whom the bell tolls. For whom does the bell toll if you don't speak for them? Well, what I'm driving at is that what we need to see is that these were 30 wonderful, courageous people, some of them here tonight. And they have just as strong and important and honorable a role as Sissy did. But Sissy actually came along and became a part of history. I want to say this about her, that I've kind of worked this out, not to embarrass her, but she deserves not the Nobel Prize for Peace, but the Citizens Prize for Nobility in the Common Good. Rarely indeed, few like Sissy come along. And I don't mean to over-personalize it, but the fact of the matter is, this is what I want to say, they matter. They are permanent signals. Remember, Martin Luther King said something like the arc of justice is long, but it bends toward, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. Right. Well, Sissy's a part of that.
Thank you, Ronnie. I was really reluctant. Wasn't that wonderful? I'm very reluctant. I was very reluctant to interrupt the godfather of progressive journalism. But you gave the whole program away. So
I'd rather, if I can, escape that lousy nomenclature.
okay, well, you'll have to talk to Piper about that. Okay. But anyway, but I thought it was appropriate. I do want to say a couple of things before we start the questions. I'm not going to say anything. This is to be a discussion. We have a wonderful panel, and they are going to discuss some of the issues related to the 30, but also those of you in the audience who have experience and want to contribute, we want you to be part of that discussion. So 2 quick things before the representative asks the first question. One, Morgan is here, and we'll have a microphone. If you have questions you'd like to ask, please get her attention. We'll do questions as we go throughout the conversation, so make sure that you grab her if you have a question. And I will be working with the representative going back and forth on questions. So let's get the discussion started, shall we?
Great, wonderful. Thank you for those introductory remarks. As Sissy mentioned, we depend a lot on volunteers, on staff, and young attorneys that are willing to help and do the work for us to present on the floor. And I know colleagues that are here would agree with that. We have Representative Elliot Neistat and former Senator Barrientos. I'd like to start with the resolution itself, and I know you mentioned Terry did a lot of that work in preparing that, and if y'all can start at that point and explain the resolution and how that discussion was initiated and how you were able to get the support.
It is astounding to people to know who don't know much about the legislature what the power of the Speaker of the House is today and what it was then. And for those who think about America as a democratic country, to see how the Texas House of Representatives was run then, it was shocking by any standards to see how nailed down everything was, so that even raising your hand to ask a question was not permissible. You had to ask permission to ask permission. It was just, it was oppression by any standard. And it was reinforced by a variety of rulings that had been made. So how to even ask the question procedurally, like Mrs. Farenthold wanted to do, is what happened? How did this happen here in our body? How did the Sharpstown Bank transactions and legislation occur? Asking the question was not obvious about how you could do it, because they had a system. If you did the normal thing, like when you studied civics, even as a lawyer, hell, if you went to UT Law School, they didn't tell you how to do this. I guarantee you we didn't learn how to bring this up. It just wasn't obvious. And to say is that the whole system was set so that there were resolutions, but they would be sent to the committees to be killed dead before arrival. So that the challenge was to, in as simple a language as possible, and Sissy did it with Lane and others, about what happened, because we read that, and we had the indictments from the United States government and others, to put together the basic facts as we understood them, and to ask for an investigation. A very straightforward, normal thing. So if you read the Farenthold resolution, House Concurrent Resolution 87, it's pretty straightforward English. The challenge was how to get it up and get it discussed, because it was like, you talk about the no talk rule. It was just, and the punishments that occurred, Tom Bass could tell you the kind of punishments if you got out of line and you, quote, were no longer on the team. If you weren't on the team, you were not, you didn't even need to wear the uniform. It didn't matter. So I guess that's the simple thing to say, is the challenge and the courage that it took is you really need to see the courage of these people and what they did. That's all.
How did you line up the votes? Because we've talked about this before. How did you get the votes you needed to second the resolution? Because you talked about it as being kind of, all of you worked on it.
It was quite secret. I mean, you had to know that you had to, it's like being a member of a criminal conspiracy, because if one of the people you talked to snitched you off or something, I mean, it really was a reign of terror. It's hard to think of it now, but of course it was a time Watergate was still on the way of happening, and it was the Vietnam War, and it was a time when you were not with the dominant ruling class and you were standing for your rights. It was very difficult. So the answer is secretly. We met secretly and had code words and signals, and thinking that your phones were tapped, which was a normal thing. That a state representative couldn't, if you talked on the phone, you just couldn't. So
They knew where you were going. I had a Congress legislator from the Valley, had a radio. He said he wasn't supposed to have it, but it was tied into the DPS. And one Monday, he came over to me to tell me that he'd heard on the radio that I was over at Ronnie Duggar's house.
Oh, God.
But let me mention, before we go back to Terrence, because he researched how we could do this. Within a week of my being in the legislature, this was my second session, but my first session, I was invited to lunch. And it was a man from LaGrange, a legislator, and there were about 5 or 6 of them. He's the only one I remember because he was on the Texas football team many years earlier. They wanted to tell me how to work with the team. The term was used. It didn't really register with me, but I got my first introduction of what the system was. That luncheon about 10 days after I was up there. Back to you, Terrence, because it couldn't have done it, and Lane was in on that thing, on the procedural thing, how we worked right there in the House that morning.
That jars in my memory. I was a member of the Texas Rump delegation to the Democratic National Convention of 1972. And I believe that the initiative for Sissy as vice president came from John Kenneth Galbraith from Massachusetts. And of course, it went to where she finished second. But that kind of stuff was not in practice in the National Democratic Party. No. We didn't feel like criminals. We were yelping like happy dogs.
Well, I remember when I decided to break, the speaker called a meeting of committee chairs. Now, I was still a chair at that point. And that didn't seem unusual to me, so I went. But that particular meeting was simply all the other committee chairs trying to get me to go along with the team.
Yeah, Tom sacrificed more, I think, than any of us. We all had our little things. Speaker Cameraman was taking pictures of my son, and Dave Allred had misery when he went home from Muncher's supporters and so on. But Tom gave up everything he'd worked for all those years as far as his position in the House. And we could not have done the things that we did without his knowledge of the rules. To the point that the parliamentarian Bob Johnson many years later told me, he said, you all would walk in and we didn't know what was going to come next. Thanks to Tom Bass.
Can you tell us, how were you able to force this vote? Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Well, it was at the magic moment, you know, when it's like, if something like this happened, it's hard to understand, but it is, from the perspective of the people who are running the system, it was as if you were committing treason in their presence. So it required people who had scripts to do what they did. And of course, Lane had the spot of coming up right after Sissy. We knew what was going to happen. We pretty much had, it's like in a game, we pretty much knew what they were going to do in response to us, and had alternatives. And of course, Tom had that one of making damn sure that you got Mutcher off the podium, which came up on the point of order that the speaker had to leave in order, so that they had to have a replacement speaker. And you can't, it's just really hard to capture the emotion of what that moment was.
Can you explain that a little more for those of the audience that may not know that parliamentary procedure?
In a parliamentary procedure, they thought that it was a personal privilege by the woman. And so they didn't even understand. They were speaking a different language. There is a personal privilege in the House when someone has offended you or used bad language or whatever. So they were all kind of reacting to, oh, it's going to be one of these things. And it was not. It was privilege of the House, and that is to say that it was a matter of privilege because the dignity of the House had been offended by the conduct of the Speaker and the people in the House, which is of a motion of the highest privilege. But it must be seconded by 10 people, and to get those 10, it was, if you look on the back of the $2 bill and they say, we pledge our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor to this thing, and in the Declaration of Independence, those guys would have lost their lives if that thing hadn't gone their way. When these people were signing up to do the seconding on that, it was their warrant. It was their political death warrant in that system. And they said things like, I want to give you a lesson about being disloyal, and then I'm going to ruin you. And they would. And that's the courage. That's what I'm saying to these people who signed. It is not possible for you to think in a normal system what that was like, that these people worked, and they were not just that, they would be vilified, they would be humiliated and all these other things.
And you'd get the pressure from your constituents.
Oh, yeah, and they arranged that.
They arranged that.
They brought in a commissioner from Harris County to talk to me, to try to get me to change my position. They try anything.
So how quickly did you get to 30? Did you lose some?
Nobody knew on the 30. That was the freedom, is that after we got the 10 and got it up to the vote, and that's where Tom Moore was so important as an eloquent person, as a prosecutor, and he got up and he said the magic word, bribery. This is bribery. And he looked them in the eye and he said, don't you guys, think you're laughing and all that kind of stuff. And boy, then this sudden, that electricity in that room, and we all knew it was bribery. And that's when the debate opened up, and you never knew who, when they called the roll, we didn't have any idea how many people were going to vote.
No, because there were 23, I think, of our initial group.
Right,
And then the 30 came from the vote.
yeah. Yeah, we picked up
So
7.
there were 7
Yeah,
additional.
yeah.
Actually, the 30 is a little bit misleading because that 30 was clearly from the vote, but we had about 4 or 5 others that were with us most of the time.
And in the outset, it was a point really of derision. I mean, we were just ridiculous scolds, so to speak. And then as the session went on and things happened, and that changed, but we were called kamikaze,
Right.
like the pilots in the Japanese. But in any event, the attitude changed. I remember, and then it got to be, later on, it was, there was a lightheartedness about it later on, just as Johnson said, I don't know what you all are going to do, but we would get flowers. I remember I wore mine by my ear. I don't know what the men did with theirs.
Or my ears.
Do you remember that there was some House member who was I think he was from Pasadena, I can't remember. He got his guitar out on the last night of the session.
Oh, Johnny Nelms.
Johnny Nelms, and
Johnny
sang the
Nelms.
song, Everything You Touch Turns to Dirt. And, you know, it was just like, and there were people by this time from the New York Times and others who were covering, and they said, I can't believe this. I can't believe it here on the floor of the Texas House of Representatives, and this guy's singing this song. And of course, it was just, and he was singing to you.
You know,
But
I want to
we had
kind
some
of,
light moments as well as the heavy ones, I can assure you.
I want to kind of add a interesting point that's raised here about just the history and the context that led up to the vote on the resolution, because I know we kind of got into the Farenthold resolution, which was about the ethics investigation of the speaker and other members. But interestingly, when you think about when this all began to play out, it was Inauguration Day, 1971. President Smith was being inaugurated, and on this day was the day that the U.S. Security and Exchange Commission actually filed this case. So you had this news to come out on the day of inauguration. It seems that what were the other kind of points of context that were happening that led up to your actions? Because I think we've talked about the resolution, but maybe backing into the who and the what was happening at the time that led to the March resolution.
Let me just try to recall a few things and ask everyone else to enter into the thing. At the outset, I remember reading it in one of the local papers about the SEC. And then I came up to the legislature, and in the beginning of that session, it was the Republicans that had the leadership. There was a Earthman from Houston was in the leadership. And the Democrats at the outset were those that had sort of been together in my first session. It was the same group, what I used to call some East Texas liberals, Hannah and a couple of them out there, and then some other people in the Houston part of the Houston delegation. But it was at the outset a Republican effort, the discussion of this. And I remember that one Republican came back and said, my county chair just told me to leave this alone. I don't remember who it was. But then the Democrats, we started to move forward, and they stayed in it. The Republicans stayed in it, but they were not in the leadership on it.
Well, the House leadership buttonholed me and said, look, you're going after a Democrat when you're going after the Speaker. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I think he's wrong. But it clearly was Republicans that were after
Smith, I guess. But they moved back, and I've never got an answer of why they moved back on this issue, but they did.
No Republican took a leadership position.
Mm-mm.
And they just sort of faded a little bit there.
And I want to mention one thing, because we had a plan. What Ronnie isn't mentioning is on the back of a placemat at a Mexican restaurant, and he tells me he doesn't remember it. he wrote down the whole thing of what our legislative program would be. In other words, what we would be doing. And part of it was writing letters to other legislators to see if they'd come into this ethics issue and so forth. In addition to that, what we had initially wanted, and much too ambitious looking back, was to have a joint resolution, a resolution in both the House and the Senate. And on the basis of that, I took, whether it was the resolution itself or some form of it, Terrence, over to the senator from, there were 5 or 6, in quotes, liberals, and I'm sorry Babe Schwartz isn't here.
Yeah, sorry.
Is he here? Anyway, because I took it over to the senator from Dallas,
Mosey.
Mosey, and put it on his desk early and said, would you pass this around and see if there's any support? Because this is what, and I laid out what we were trying to do, which was a joint resolution. And that's why that resolution didn't come up till March 15th, the Ides of March, wasn't it? Was because we were waiting on the Senate. And I was always, I went in one time to see the speaker because I'd go in to tell him what we were doing, not on this particular resolution, but on issues. He was really angry, and he said, well, you couldn't get that through the Senate, could you? He knew all about it. He knew all about it. So I just want to put that in the background because our initial idea was to have both houses involved in it. But
Well,
it
to be
failed.
fair, I worked for Oscar Mosey at that time, and Oscar was supportive. He just didn't have the votes. And he had D. Roy Harrington, Babe Schwartz, Barbara Jordan, Kennard. Yeah, there were others who were supportive, and while they, and I don't know.
But Terry, they didn't have the votes either. I
Yeah,
don't
I
quite
know.
understand.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying is that they were trying to really actually pass it.
They were what?
They were trying to pass it. They had 11 at that time that they were counting.
What
so,
were they going to do with the lieutenant governor?
well, it was impossible there. Yeah, I mean, they're,
Ben Bourne said
yeah,
it.
Ben Barnes, it was, but they had enough to hold up the Senate if they had achieved critical mass themselves because they had enough of the 2/3 rule that said to suspend rules.
Well,
to
he never
conduct-
said a thing to me.
Yeah,
It
well,
just
no,
never moved.
Yes,
But that's why we went
that's true.
with what we
You had
did
to,
when
that's
we
right.
did.
At the
That's what
time.
counts.
But we couldn't wait any longer.
I remember that.
You
couldn't.
moved, but you only had 30 votes, 23 as far as you knew. I think that needs to be faced. They backed down, they didn't join the fight.
That's right.
Tell us about the role of the media and how did they help build momentum or bring attention?
The Observer was great. There was a woman, used to think it was Jim Lair, but it turned out there was a woman that worked for him that insisted he have us, the representatives of the Dirty 30, on from time to time. He had a news hour on PBS in Dallas. And there were, the Dallas newspapers didn't touch it, period. When I campaigned out in Amarillo, they didn't know what I was talking about, nor did they know what I was talking about in Lubbock, because those papers were just they never covered it.
Yeah. And the Houston Chronicle was like the South Africa Gazette. It was controlled by Houston Endowment.
Yeah.
It simply wouldn't cover anything. If it did, it was negative. But Felton West from the Houston Post did cover some of the stories so that it was a live as a real press story.
And then one of the things we had, which we don't have now, were, for lack of the correct word, I'll say independent radio stations.
Yeah.
And there was some Texas radio network,
that's
and we
right.
were on that all the time.
Right.
But I don't think that exists any longer.
Representative
Who
Luna,
was it? Carlton, who? Well, it'll come.
Representative Luna, may I ask if you would include Lane Denton in those offered to volunteer comment, because he was there.
That, he's not only there, he was, when they turned me down, It was Lane that
I
spoke.
mean, can we regard him as a member of this panel?
Susan's
Maybe we
got
do
the
that?
microphone.
Okay.
Is there a fee?
I got $1.
Well, it's really nice to see a wonderful, friendly audience. I've been fighting mostly sorry Republicans. And believe me, this state, Ronnie, is in trouble,
I'll say that.
without a doubt.
No doubt.
But we're going to have to do something about it, and we need to get a lot more sissy Parenthals going. I was just thinking, walking down the hall, that what an amazing different state we'd be in today as I walked by Alan Shivers' portrait and thought, what if Sissy Farenthal's portrait had been there? Wouldn't that have been incredible? And out of the Dirty 30 crowd, just think of the ones that have run for statewide office. Fred Head is here. As determined and courageous a representative as you could have. And let's see who else. Ben Grant, Tom Moore, ran for Attorney General. Part of my arrival in the legislature in '71 was working with Bernard Rappaport in Waco and going through the campaigns with Ralph Yarber over and over. Kind of helped educate someone going into the legislature that all these old conservative Democrats were bad news. And Sissy touched on the appropriations bill, spending, I don't know, $25 billion in '71. Representative Luna, I don't know what it is now, 200. It's way up there. But Bill Heatley, the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, would vote out the final bill not far from here at his penthouse apartment up on the top floor, and just and serve a fabulous dinner and tell everybody vote for it, yes. And then the bill goes, and Sissy's correct. You just had a few hours, and they probably didn't even, as I recall, print it. So you were sort of lost in the whole thing. I'll say this, Representative Tom Bass, and I have to, because somebody talked about wiretaps early and all the DPS shenanigans that were going on. We really didn't trust Tom Bass right at the initial. Because just think about it. Here you have this chairman of the committee, on the Rules Committee, and all of a sudden he has a come to Jesus meeting, I guess. But it turned out, and I'll say this, as time went on, we really found out he was a true friend, and he did know the rules. And the staff, we didn't have any staff. We usually had one secretary, and most of the time that secretary would just type the letters back home. Thank you very much for your letter. I appreciate your views. I look forward to talking to you. And as one of the representatives said, never tell them, I think it was Lindsay Rodriguez, never tell them which side you're on, for it or against it. You can always change. And as Tom Moore said, don't ever answer a letter, Gonzalo. You know Tom real well, because he said, look, it's just not, if you vote right, they're going to be with you. If you vote against them, they're not going to like you, but part of it. But back to Sissy, I'm certain, Ronnie, most people in Texas really don't understand the courage of a state legislator who was the only member, as I recall, that voted no on the resolution to honor the birthday of LBJ. That took some courage. I would have liked to have said but I wasn't with Sissy on that one. Most of the time, she led me astray, and I got into some real trouble over that. But Gus Mutcher would probably still be Speaker of the today if things. The first time I went in his office, his desk was about this size, and he pulled out the bottom left drawer and said, Representative Denton, I can serve, look at my pledge cards, I can be speaker for, I'm guaranteed 10 more years, so you need to get on the team. Well, a lot has happened, but I won't take too much time because the sign's going to come up here real fast. But on that day, and the strategy, pretty brilliant on the part of Glenn Wilkerson and Terry, to do the motion, privilege motion, and the speaker, and I guess the fact that Sissy was there kind of confused the whole front of the House, but at the early morning of the session, you're up there offering resolutions to praise the Boy Scouts or to praise the Andrews football team for winning the state championship. Well, he recognized Sissy and she made her motion. But without going into all the details, the most difficult time, we knew it was going to be chaos and trouble, is there a second? And the motion, the rules required 10 seconds, and so yes, there, 10, and then the speaker said, "Stand up." And I don't think everybody stood up. Curtis Graves was down in the basement. We had to send for him, and we got him in there. But we had taken the initiative to get the 10 members to actually sign a piece of paper that they were seconding the motion. Otherwise, we would have lost, I'm certain, because it would have just disappeared, right? But the motion was seconded, and each side had, I think, 30, 40 minutes to argue. Terry probably can remember better. But the speaker would not leave the podium. The rules require that if a successful challenge to the chair, he has to leave. And Speaker Mutcher did not leave the podium for another, 30 minutes, 45 minutes? And finally, DeWitt Hale came up, colleague from Corpus of Sissies, and said, "Mr. Speaker, I think you're going to have to leave." And he just could not believe that it was happening, but he did. And we had the debate, and we took the vote, and of course, the 30 votes resulted. And just to give you one little example of what happens to you, of course, you don't pass any legislation. I don't know how much legislation Sissy was going to be passing. But because her reputation was already there, and I'll say this, most of the colleagues never in the coffee room, the House chamber, they didn't refer to as Representative Farenthal. They would usually say, "That woman." That was pretty much it every time. But Tom Moore lived on the western side of McClellan County. I lived over on the east side. We ended up in the same legislative district. It's just one example. There were probably 50 major crazy battles. And if you really want to take time and get the old observers, Ronnie was kind of, I guess, masterminding there, and he had Kay Northrop and Molly Ivins. Some of the best stories you will ever read of the session, because the reporters were all over the House floor, and Molly was kind of hanging over there. And to her credit today, in 1971, I would venture to say at least half of her stories she wrote completely stoned. But we loved her anyway. She was fantastic, and I'll be happy to answer some more questions, because all hell did break loose, and we were clobbered in many, many ways as a result of that. But think about we wouldn't have probably gotten people like Gonzalo Barrientos in the legislature if this all hadn't happened. And then look at the 73 session. A friend of mine works in the White House, and when they were talking about the Consumer Protection Act and how wonderful, and this is so new and exciting, I said, "Are you kidding? We passed that in the 70s in Texas." He said, "Oh, well, the president, he didn't know about it." So it does make a difference. And when you talk about open meetings and open records, lobby regulation, we tape recording all the committees, record votes. Oh, gee, the 73 session is the result of one person willing on a single day to stand up and say, I offer this motion, and we fight that.
Lane, may I ask you a question? Because the one written account of this, book size, is Harvey Katz. And my impression was that you were responsible for getting him down to Austin, but I've never known the details.
Well, I'm 50% finished with my autobiography. If I don't hurry up, I'm going to have to call Don. Because if you want to read, I just finished 2 books, The Red Scare and J.R. Parton. And to the background which you led into, the early days in Texas politics and J.R. Parton, are wonderful books, and everybody should read those. But a guy named Robert Choate, I was director of the Special Services Division for the Waco School District. And he said, we have got to move the school lunch program out of the U.S. House Agriculture Committee. We've been trying for 20 years. W.R. Poe, who had been in Congress, my former assistant Roy Wathal's here. He served, 40-something years? He just, back in those days, even in the House of Representatives, of course, they just killed it over and over. And Choate said, we understand there's malnutrition in Falls County and Marlin. Will you help document that and get it up here to Washington, and we're going to expose the congressman? And I did. And so when this hit, I called Choate and said, we have no staff. We've got a huge problem, a major possible investigation that needs reform in the legislature. He said, I think I know just the person, and I'll try to get the funding from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. And they funded Harvey Katz to come to Texas, and he hung out with Molly and used the resources, I'm sure, of Texas Observer, and ultimately ended up writing a book. And then Bernard Rappaport paid for him to write speeches for you in the campaign. Probably illegal, but anyway. Bernard's dead, Harvey's dead. But isn't it wonderful to see all these, everybody looking good today? Even Terry, my goodness, who was about 18 years old when I first met him. Great, but we'll answer any questions you have.
Was Harvey Katz also, you kind of operated as your legislative, kind of as your informal legislative agent, because he was involved in all that?
Yes, he was working out of my office, not paid or anything, but in those days you could, Terry was on the payroll in the Senate, but he worked in the House, and we probably got more work out of him, so it was all
Well,
changeable.
Lane kept it a secret because I never knew Harvey Katz was anything except your secretary. But he and Madeline O's volunteered to check within 18 hours all of that 400-page appropriation bill. And so, and then he wrote the book.
Right, and that is a great story. Can you talk to folks about the appropriation bill?
Well, yeah.
Thank you, Lane.
Well, normally you have about an hour. Normally you have about an hour to question the bill. And Lane indicated Bill Heatley already had lined up the vote. So about an hour, you have this thick in front of you, and it passes. Well, what I had these students under Karen Lerner do was to go through everything in the appropriation bill. And anything in which an appropriation was considerably more or considerably less than either was requested or the previous year, give me a slip of paper on it. And so the next morning I called a meeting at the 30:30, and I had this stack of papers because each one of them was separate. And I said, I don't care what you do with these things, except you're going to ask questions. And I wrote down the name of who took which one, and we kept them on the floor for 12 hours. Didn't pass anything, but we kept them on the floor for 12 hours.
But can you back up and talk about the reason why you had to go that route? What was the problem and
Well, the
what was happening with the
appropriations-
bill in the first place?
Appropriations, the one I remember particularly was the moss cutter. I think it was Slider, it was from Jim Slider from there, had put in, I think it was $62,500 for moss cutters for Caddo Lake. And we, asked him about it. Oh, well, we have to have that. And there was all these things for people who were close to the speaker were there, including Bill Heatley. And this was what I think got the mainline media
Yes.
more or less interested in what was going on, because we were pointing out very specific instances where what they were doing, although maybe not illegal, was certainly immoral.
It was embarrassing, is what,
Yeah.
that you shamed them in front of that. And I remember at the time is that, and God bless the Observer, because the standard of journalism was that the press were either playing cards or drunk or whatever, and that this was the moment, not the Farenthold resolution, but this was the moment that really turned the lights on in the press. And suddenly they all had little stories about the kind of petty corruption that people could understand, so that the bigger picture of National Banker's Life and Sharpstown State Bank and all that, and suddenly, and the speaker made X $1,000 on stock that he never even
Right.
saw, and Elmer Baum was in on it and all of that. So it was the magic moment. That was that effort.
Yeah, fact is, I knew they were going to try to stop us, so I pulled out of my normal chair in the House, got over on one side where there was about half a dozen of the 30-30, and had my aides come to me, and Sissy Farenthold has one of the questions, but she's not going to sit there 12 hours, Nobody's going to sit there 12 hours. And so I'd send these aides out to tell Sissy, you got one coming up pretty soon.
Yeah.
And that way we kept it going.
I mean, that kind of brings up a question, and someone had asked earlier about putting some of these things in a broader context. So we have two things. The representative was asking about the role of the media in bringing attention to this. But the other issue, of course, was that, the leadership didn't want attention brought to this. So part of what you were doing, both with the resolution and when we were just talking about the appropriations bill, was finding ways not just, to make the process transparent, one, but then two, by doing that, it also, brought attention to it by getting both media attention, and then also the goal was to really get to the public and let them know what they didn't know about what was happening. So it strikes me that a lot of your process, was about trying to get that attention out.
Incident to that was the so-called local consent calendar, which is utterly ridiculous, but the speaker would wait and get about 100 of those and put them out, and we'd have 2 hours blocked aside to pass those 100 bills. Well, now the rules said it only took 5 to knock it off, but when you got 100 of them, everybody's got a bill on there, so you couldn't get 5 to knock them off. So you just pass them through.
May I make a point that you just suggested in a different way? Well, what's the point of going back 40 years to this particular congeries of corruptions and oppressive government? Well, hell, it's still the same.
Sure.
The point is that for somebody like Sissy and her group and all of them as individuals to stand up when they didn't have a chance to win, what's the point of that? The point of that is to start a real movement again. We don't have one. The Democratic Party hardly exists. The last 100 statewide elections all have been won by one party, not the other. Not one victory since 1994. Well, that's pretty comparable to the situation in 1971, and I would simply make the point quickly. Well, this is a model for how to start again.
Well, I don't know if anyone else feels this way, but I feel that one of the reasons why we didn't succeed, we did succeed in getting rid of the speaker,
That's right.
the lieutenant governor, the governor, and electing a majority the next time that could do some good. But the guy who became speaker, a dirty 30, had one rule that I told him, don't go with that. And he went with it. And that was that a speaker could only serve one term. That sounds good, reform. But you don't get something to stick until you get enough people to have enough vested interest. And if he had stayed speaker 2 or 3 terms, I think you would have seen the reform rules hang in there. But as soon as he said he wasn't going to run a second time, Bill Clayton.
But if you don't have the spark of public attention, you don't have a movement. I mean, Ms. Randolph did it by herself almost in Houston.
Yeah.
But every time she'd make a speech, she'd say, work in your precincts and sit down. There's nothing like that going on known to me in Texas now. Maybe it is. But this is a model for starting a movement where the arc of history is turns toward justice.
No, thank you, Ronnie, because I think it also does bring us to the connection to the present, and then the critical discussion of what is the legacy, and then how do you sustain reform once you've started reform. So let's take a question, and we'll keep the conversation going.
Sissy, can you just speak briefly about the content of your resolution? I mean, what it.
Well, it was for an investigation, and really, I had cut my teeth my first session there over the Jerry Sadler situation. So I was aware of the way the system worked to some extent. But I had also done as my thesis at Vassar on tracing the creation of legislation from the social need to the courts and the whole deal. So I was teed off with myself, because I had voted for one, just in a mechanical kind of way, in that special session for one of the Sharpstown Bank bills. There was enough time between the first and second bill for me to run over to the Senate and ask Bill Patman, who was my advisor in all banking issues, about the bill. He said, it's a bad bill. So here I was, so contradicting myself, having voted for one bill and then against the next bill. So that really got me to thinking about what is legislation and how is it done and so forth. So that was the background, one element of it, not the whole thing, but certainly one element. And I don't know, it was, I guess when people are all powerful, they don't want to even open the door a little. Because later on, he named a panel with Captain Tuna,
Yes.
I think it was. That was what the legislator from Port Arthur. Port Arthur?
Oh, yeah.
Carl Parker.
Captain Tuna.
What was his
He
name?
was
Carl
a member of the
Parker.
team. And it was just a hopeless, it didn't mean anything. But I don't know, I think maybe if Muncher had gone along with it, and it might have just sort of passed off. I don't know.
It's come up several times, but Sharpstown scandal was what the whole argument was about. All of this, the way we did it is what we're talking about, but it was brought about because of the Sharpstown scandal. Ronnie, why don't you briefly tell them what that is?
I don't remember.
Oh, that's a cop-out.
Well, it's true.
The Sharpstown scandal
I was out of the state, maybe.
was, at that time, there was a bank in Sharpstown called Sharpstown National Bank. And Frank Sharp was the president, 80% of the stock and so on. And he decided that he needed special legislation in Austin to put the bank under the state control rather than federal control. And that's this bill that Sissy was talking about. It was just sort of like a...
In the special session, I don't even know if it had hearings or anything, because, that the special session took care of a lot of stuff.
But as it became more obvious, the speaker had a potential $70,000 profit, but he took 25 and borrowed and reinvested and lost.
Yeah.
Because Sharp didn't guarantee seconds. But the speaker, the governor, the chairman of the appropriation committee, and many other members received 15, 20, 25,000, all the way up to 50,000. Now, that doesn't sound like too much today, but that's probably
Was
what,
big.
300,000 or something today?
And that's when I use the term that they use their public office for collateral.
Good.
That's the gist of it.
And the loans to buy the insurance stock were funded by Frank Sharp's bank, Sharpstown Bank, and
Yeah,
then in turn, he funded the
Sharpstown-
lawmakers' purchase of the stock from insurance companies he owned.
Right.
So it was incredibly detailed.
He would sell them at a good price, stock in, it wasn't Sharpstown itself, but it was another facility they had control over.
I think it was National Bankers Life.
Right,
But-
it was, yeah.
National Bankers Life.
Yeah,
That was the insurance
Two
company,
insurance
right.
companies were involved.
And then Sharp took this stock that he spoke for it, to the Jesuit fathers at Jesuit High School and said, this is a good investment. And they paid 3 times what the guys had paid for it.
Yeah.
And then they went broke. They had to do all kinds of things to take care of Jesuit. So all of this is Sharpstown stock scandal, and this is what's leading to this.
The session before, the year before, I was going in to see the speaker a lot over my Sadler resolution. And I'd go in and ask to see him, and every time I did, they'd say, oh, the speaker is in Houston. And I'd say, what is he doing in Houston? And they would say, well, he's at NASA. I think he was at Sharpstown.
Let me tell you that when the Observer started, the legislature was so corrupt it was unbelievable. And maybe it still is, because all sorts of devices, if you're a lawyer in the legislature, well, then you can have clients in your law firm who are not specific to you, but you get them because you're in the law firm, etc. And in May of the first year after the first full year of the Observer, I invented a little device to get some stories. There were about 30 or 40 liberals, and there were some extremely honorable conservatives, and I had some relationships on both sides. And I made a deal with them that if you'll tell me about bribery in the legislature, I promise not to give your name or where you're from or say a word about anything else about you except that you're a representative or a senator. And they sang about bribery, that at just a page of the Observer, they talk of bribery. I remember Bob Eckhart drew one of his wonderful cartoons of an astonishingly corpulent and successful member of the legislature, maybe taking the money, I don't remember. But one of this, just to give you a feeling of it, one of them said, well, you know, Representative so-and-so is carrying that bill, and it comes with 2 copies and $500 attached. That's the way it was. It was that obvious. So you guys are just going on, and I don't quite see enough journalism along that line now, although the Observer's working on some things, and I think some of the dailies are. But they have something called, what is it called, hash accounts now? There's something that needs investigation now, so that's all a part of awakening the people to what's happening to their state.
I like that, and I want to come back and ask the representative some questions about that to tie it in with what's going on now. But we've got a question here.
Yeah. Sorry.
My name is Roy Walthoff from Waco, and I had the great privilege of working for Lane Denton. Thank you very much. But also Bill Alshire, county judge of Travis County, and Margaret Moore, who was the daughter of Tom Moore. Anyway, he worked us ragged in that next session, basically, where I think we alone passed over, you might have not passed anything before, but we passed like 130 bills or something into laws. I mean, it was fantastic in that next session. But I remember, and I'm so glad Fred hit us here, because I remember the Constitutional Convention and Article 3 committee that you were on, but we had, I think, the 3 candidates for Speaker running in that committee, basically in the Constitutional Convention. And as I kind of remember vaguely, and I want y'all to help me out, the dirty 30 split, basically. I think we had 2 candidates running for Speaker, and then, of course, Billy Clayton. and this is about the legacy of the Dirty 30, that's where it slipped backwards, kind of. So I agree with you, Representative Bass. That's kind of where Price Daniel didn't run for re-election, but we had a good candidate, Fred Head. And so what happened there? Where did the leadership not, or I don't know if there was a leadership of the Dirty 30, but basically, what Lane, I want to ask you, what happened in that to cause that split, kind of where we didn't have one candidate or something?
Well, I think it'd be better to ask the...
Well, yes, Fred, who we were basically supporting, yes.
Notice all these dirty 30 old gray-haired folks.
Oh, I get it.
It's really good to be here with you tonight. I haven't seen this many Democrats in one room since the Billy Saul Estes trial opened What can we do with our experience and our history to make things better now? That's what we're really here about. You've heard from these very courageous people, and the three that you've already heard from are the ones that really put it all together. Some of the rest of us tried to help, but they're the ones that masterminded it and made it happen. And I'm so proud to be here tonight, get to say hello to them and this group of people who I know have worked hard for good government. Now, what we found ourselves into when we got down here in '71 is what you've already heard. Special interest running the government. Very little transparency. And some people gave everything they had in time and talent and effort to try to make it better. And out of that came what has been come to be referred to as the Dirty 30. It would have never happened if we hadn't had press following what these three leaders did and what the staff folks did to bring it together and then bring it to the people. At the beginning of the session, people really didn't know what was going on in Texas. By the end of the session, they did know. And what happened out of it was we got some real change in the next election. Nobody who was a part of the Dirty 30 failed to win re-election. We got rid of the people that needed to be left at home. And as you've already heard, in the 1973 session, some really good things were done, like the Deceptive Trade Practices Act, the Open Meetings Law, the Open Records Law. And I think we were on the brink or on the edge of really extending this into the future. But as you've heard, there was a speaker's race. But before that speaker's race, there was that interesting election in 1972 where some of us had some almost fatal experiences, in fact. The lobby fought really, really hard to try to reelect a lot of their people. But because people of good faith and those who wanted to support good government ran, we got rid of the ones, as I said earlier, that needed to be left at home. I had the experience of having my district changed 4 different times. And finally, in 1972, they paired me with the new Speaker of the House, a fellow named Rayford Price. Yes. And they felt sure that they'd get rid of me at that time, and they would be able, with Mr. Price, to continue business as usual. I think one person probably had more to do with changing, if you will, the quality of the water and the direction of the river in that election. And I'm going to take the personal privilege,
you will, of asking my wife to stand up. My wife, Marcia, is here tonight. She's the lady. Marcia, where you at? Marcia walked door to door. Everybody told us we couldn't win. We couldn't beat the Speaker of the House because that had never happened in the history of Texas. She walked door to door throughout Henderson County, one of the new counties. I had 6,000 people left in my legislative district out of about 78,000. We got 3 new counties. Everybody said, oh, Mr. Rayford Price, the Speaker's going to win. This lady walked door to door, and we beat the sitting Speaker of the House 65% to 35% in that county. And for that reason, we were able to have a new Speaker. And I don't think we would have had a new Speaker had we not beat this fella back in the district, because the lobby has a stranglehold on not only the Lieutenant Governor's office, but also the Speaker's office. And so the new Speaker, Price Daniel Jr., was able to be elected, I believe, more than any other reason, because of what this one brave lady did by spending the time and effort. She just happened to be my wife, and I'm so very proud of her and love her so much. But that story's never really been told, and it really needs to be told, and I apologize for making a personal story out of it. But in any event, we did a lot of good things in 1973 in the session. Now, how does that relate to now? Well, it's a hell of a lot worse now than it ever was, I'm afraid. Before 1971, it was bad then. But you have seen people in Texas government for the last several years make us the very top in everything that's bad. We're number one in everything that's bad, and we're at the bottom of everything that's good. And ladies and gentlemen, that's not right for the people of Texas. It's not right for the ordinary citizens. It's not right for the people you love and your family. And I think people are ready for a change. Now, how can we look back on what we've done in years past and how these 3 brave people that you've already heard from tonight, and these staff folks and these writers in the media who told the story, how can we look back on that and make something out of that today that will bring about the change we need and make it last? That's what I'm here tonight to ask you to consider. I know that each of you here tonight would like to see that happen, or you wouldn't be here. And I know you're willing to work very hard to see it happen. We can talk about a lot of specifics, but I think what we need to do tonight is to resolve that we're going to make it happen, and then try to look at the history that we have and see how we can put these building blocks together. And I think the old block by block, get the votes together and get them out. The hard work is going to have to happen. I think that the climate's right for the kind of big change if we can get some courageous people who are now in government to stand up, as these 3 people that you've already heard from did in 1971. And I believe the press will cover it. I believe they'll tell the story. And I believe if we can do that, things are going to be a lot better in the future. It's not time to give up. It's not time to say that we can't make it better, because I know that we can. Now, the question was asked about the Speaker's race. I think Sissy referred to the fact that there was a fellow who was put in a position of responsibility named Parker. Mr. Parker decided he wanted to run for Speaker. I had worked in the years previous to 1971 and in the 71 session toward the possibility of at some point in time being Speaker. And I had a good lead at the point in time that the Constitutional Convention convened, But as a result of some of the things in the Constitutional Convention that I didn't think were good, I voted against the Constitution. I held together quite a few of the people that were supporting me for Speaker, but some of my friends who wanted to be fathers of the Constitution, who people knew to be my friends, didn't like the fact that I voted against it, and so they decided to withdraw their support from me to be the Speaker. And that's the short answer to why I didn't get to be Speaker and hopefully continue what had been done in the 1973 session. As a result of that, we got business as usual from the new Speaker, and it's regressed, in my opinion, since then to where we are today. Now, I want to thank you very much for allowing me to be here, and if we can answer any questions, we'll be glad to. I'm very honored to be on the program with you folks. Not any better people than these three folks and this staff man and this great writer that I'm here with tonight. And thank you all for being here. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer a question.
Thank you. Can I say something real quick? Okay, let's, I just wanted to be mindful of time. It's 7:25. There are a couple of other things I would like for us to be able to talk about. Especially, we've been talking around the question of how can this relate today in terms of your experience and what it means in the legislature today. I don't want to cut off the conversation, but I do want us to be aware we've got about 5 or so minutes left. So let's go to the audience and take a couple of questions. Then we're going to come back, Representative, and maybe close
I think
out
my
talking
colleague, Representative Nangstadt.
Okay. Oh, there's Bill Alshire. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bill Elshire. I guess on behalf of all the young Turks, even younger than Terry, that were there back in those days, I wanted to tell you how much we appreciate y'all. Lane Denton, thank you for giving me a chance to work for you and go through all the heck and Sissy and your campaigns in 72 and 74. It's with great appreciation, and it's still to this day with great inspiration that y'all gave us to try to move on and keep fighting. We miss your brand in government. You know, there was a time when the media wasn't paying attention. You were having to fight them as much as were the entrenched interests. The money in politics was the biggest problem we had then. It's the biggest problem we have now. It results in the public policies that we have. But you asked the question about what their legacy is.
Oh, yes, and I know you have thoughts.
Shadow on the Alamo. I found, I think, part of the answer, and I'll take a half minute to read what Harvey Katz said. When Tom Moore and Lane Denton and Cece Farenthold and Dick Reed and Tom Bass tell me that their people will awake and rebel, I believe them. I cannot disbelieve them. If they are wrong, if a group of public servants, even a handful, is unable to blast open the doors to private government, if a free electorate is powerless or unwilling to eject its corrupt leaders, then much more than Texas is in trouble. Surely we have not come to that. The less we give a damn about our public officials and the more we believe that our public officials don't give a damn about us, the closer we all move to the shame of Texas politics. If for no other reason, this is why that handful of rebels in Austin deserves our gratitude. They have shown us that there is a place for mind and flesh and human spirit among all the electric lights of modern government. They have shown that even the most apathetic citizenry can be moved by noble thought, and human beings do have the power to affect, perhaps even conquer, their mighty institutions. The lessons are there for us to follow if we choose to do so. And I'll remind Cece Farenthold of something she told us in 1972 when we didn't think we were uphill running for governor. We make our own political reality.
I want to echo what Bill Alshire is saying, but I do have a question. Speaking of speakers, was Tom Craddock really a member of the Dirty 30? And if so, what happened?
let me explain how the speaker exercises power, and you'll know why Tom wanted to be speaker. The speaker would get your pledge for the next session of the legislature, 2 years down the line, and he would not give them to you until you had actually voted for him for speaker. So anybody who wanted to be anything in the legislative process joined the team, because otherwise they have the Dirty 30. I was the only member of the Dirty, I'm not bragging, I'm just explaining. I was the only member of the Dirty 30 who was on a major committee and who chaired a committee. You didn't get those positions if you weren't there, and it's still that way.
I'd like to answer the legacy question.
Yes, go ahead.
I've been asked this, and I've gone to a lot of my friends. I work for Vince Ryan, who is sadly the highest-ranking Democratic official in Texas because he represents 4 million people in Harris County, Texas. We don't have any statewide officials. But every day in our government, and I'm talking not just the Harris County government, but the Sports and Convention Corporation, the Port of Houston, and others, we face the issues with the Public Information Act and open meetings. And open meetings had been there before, but what they did in '73 put life into it. And what the Dirty 30 did was get new people in. Bill Hobby, Lieutenant Governor, but John Hill, who I ended up working for. And he believed, endorsed, supported the making real these laws. And he got guys like Bob Heath and these others to write opinions for the Attorney General's office. And Hill did that consistently to put life into open meetings and public information, so that today every level of government operates with open meetings and Public Information Act, and that would not have happened but for their work. And so in addition, it wasn't just Hill, because he was followed by Mark White and followed by Jim Maddox, and each one of them had very smart people in their opinions committee that wrote effective jurisprudence, so that now when you take a look at Greg Abbott's stuff, you would think that the Open Meetings Act and the Public Information Act came out of the Holy Bible. You really would. And just take a look at it in the Attorney General's office. It is now a part of the culture of this state. I'd suggest the next stage is to get campaign contributions done the same way, that no matter whether you're running for the school board or no matter if you're running as a water district, wherever it is, any part of this state, to be to online, have the Secretary of State administer it so that anybody, anytime, could dial up on their computer and say, how much did she get and when did it come in? And that transparency, together, what Vince Ryan would say if he were here, we have got to register voters just like they did in Mississippi in the 60s. We have got to register Hispanic voters. We are under-registered. If our people vote, Texas will turn blue, and it will not turn blue. And it's not Democrats. I speak as a Democrat, being honest. But this is a civil rights issue as great as it was in the 1960s in Alabama, when you take a look at the conditions in some of the counties here in Texas, and that we need to do it. And that's what we need to do.
Thank you, Jerry. I want everybody to, as we conclude, for all of our panelists, to talk about what they think the legacy is. I know we've talked about specific things. We've talked about open records and increase in open government. But let's start with you, Tom, both in terms of what happened in the next session, but also what you may see as lasting even now.
I'm not sure I understood your question.
What do you think
I'm
the
like
legacy?
Sissy, I'm hard of hearing. Go ahead.
Right. Okay. Want to ask you what you think the legacy of the Dirty 30 has been. Both we've talked about short-term changes that came in the following session, but what do you think the long-term legacy is?
Well, I don't know how to answer that, but I'll put it this way. I've had a lot of classes I've taught since then, and some sharp student will say, what did you guys accomplish? And I said, well, that's not exactly, we didn't really accomplish all that much, but the mere fact that you had 30 individuals with big egos, and every politician has a big ego, get together and decide to attack the system is important.
Yes, it is. That's right.
Sissy?
Oh, well, I have something else on my agenda, and I know time is coming to a close, so I have an obsession right now, and it's about ALEC. And I'm delighted to hear that there are people here that know what ALEC is. But for those that don't, it's the American Legislative Exchange Council. And its Texas companion, the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And those people need to be exposed. They are, you know, I was thinking, what is the most significant negative that's happened since I was in the legislature? And it's privatization. And ALEC is part of that. It's a corporate state now. It's nothing more than that. So this is what I think we need to work on. How it ties into any legacy, I don't know. And I think maybe we did something. We cared for what we did. But we need people in there now that care for exposing this corporate situation we have in this state today. It's flagrant, period.
Ronnie, do you have any thoughts for us? I know one thing you said in a phone conversation we had earlier was that the Dirty 30 materialized the resistance.
Yeah.
At that point in time. So
Well, it's really
follow
not,
up on that.
I have nothing to add because the fact of the matter is either you're an active citizen or you're not. And if you're not, well, you may not be a part of the problem, but you're certainly no part of the solution. And I think the country is in danger of ending as a fair and a good place. I think it's a national problem. I remember I was driving along in my old 1948 Chevrolet when I was doing the Observer, and it crossed my mind, my God, here we are, we're trying to form a new movement here, but it might be that what we're seeing is a precursor of what will happen to the country. There were only two areas at that time where this kind of stuff was emanating from, Susan. Southern California, where they had the book burners, and here. And now, look what's happened. The Vietnam War, a gift from a Texas president to the world. Iraq War II, a war of aggression based on whether or not conscious lies, based on falsehoods. You've got the United States under President George W. engaging actively and knowingly in torture. Now, even under President Obama, we are killing people abroad with robots from responsible actors who are 7,000 miles away in this country. 70 countries have robots. Well, what are we doing to ourselves? The worst thing, of course, is the next worst thing is the oncoming global warming, which nobody's doing anything about, and the United States is dropping out of all these laws of the sea or treaties, or they go around to these world conferences and we block everything. And the worst thing is the nuclear weapons. Any one of those weapons can destroy any large city in the country. Jimmy Carter told us when he was president, and he was a nuclear engineer and knew all the facts, that one of our 14 Trident submarines, one of them, can destroy every city in the Soviet Union of any size, every large city. One. They have 14 silos and MIRVed nuclear weapons. We still got those weapons, 5,000 of them active. In that situation, what worries me is that a hell of a lot of it has come from Texas. Nuclear weapons are assembled out in Amarillo. When was that decided, and who decided it? And I'm particularly concerned that we're all sort of Texas-based progressive liberal people, but what about our congressional delegation? Who pays attention to it? The daily press doesn't report it. I confess myself, I have a feeling of insufficient breadth of understanding that the Congress is what used to govern the United States until the Supreme Court became our dictators, we're just in a hell of a shape as a country. Well, this is not the place to expect an uprising to begin, but I think we're in a hell of a shape.
I know that we are pressed for time now, and I know there are some other questions, and I'm sorry. It is 20 till 8 now. We've had a wonderful discussion. I want to thank the panelists, and I want to thank the people who were here who had so many things to contribute. And for those of you who didn't have a chance to ask your questions, we have a reception. So we'd like for you to stay. Please feel free to talk to the panelists at that time and continue the discussion and do your family reunion, which clearly is part of what's happening. Let's thank the panel.
And what did you say that